Hello, bună ziua, buongiorno, buenos dias, bonjour, and welcome to the Human Protocol of Avexa podcast. I'm Theodora Savlovschi-Wicks. I'm the founder of Avexa Partners and your host. The idea behind Avexa is pretty simple. We're here to shine a light on the individuals inside the drug development industry. Because whilst we absolutely embrace AI and automation, the tools that free us from the monotonous, the repetitive, the less glamorous corners of work, our focus stays firmly on human interaction. The emotion, the trust, the joy of a new role, the shift that happens inside a team when the right person walks through the door. The Human Protocol sits at the heart of all that. Each episode, we explore the human, either as a professional navigating a career inside drug development, or as the patient at the very center of the protocol we're all here to serve. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into it.
Hi, Ali. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you as a guest. I thought we'll start off with a little bit of an introduction, if you'd like to tell everyone who you are and, I guess how we know each other.
Yeah. Well, my name is Ali Ghiassi, and I'm based currently in Mexico City. I've spent most of my career supporting life sciences companies from a recruitment and talent acquisition standpoint, both in the US, Europe, and now Latin America. How do we know each other, Theo? We met each other years ago as competitors, I think, and then as a client. So we've had the chance to work on various things over the past probably 10 years now, and excited to be able to chat with you today.
Now, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. I guess we obviously we kind of move in the same circles when it comes to hiring in the CRO space in particular, right? And I thought it would be quite interesting for a lot of the podcast listeners to talk a little bit around the hiring myths, right, in recruitment at the moment. I think a lot of the candidates that I speak with in particular are quite disillusioned with the recruitment process overall, or there are lots of myths around AI within the recruitment process or on, how things work. And I think quite often from where I sit, I see it as a lot of the time we just kind of overcomplicate things and we make things a little bit more complex than they really are, I guess. So I thought, through our combined experience, we can probably go through some of those myths. So I guess I kind of wanted to start with how hiring works and kind of explaining, what happens behind the scenes, when a position opens, when the hiring manager says, I don't know, I need a CRA, for example. What happens next? Who's everyone that gets involved in this process, and how does the hiring look like?
That's a great question. Somebody the other day, they asked me a similar question, and they imagined that like a manager would come to me and say, I need a CRA. And then I'd like run out the door or shaking people's hands in the streets. It's not the case. Although that'd be fun to record as I do it. But really when it comes to internal, so talent acquisition, right? I work for Precision Medicine Group. I'm responsible for supporting their recruitment globally. And I have a focus right now on building out our Latin American operations. When a manager comes, or I get, let's say, typically it's an email saying this has been approved, we need to hire a CRA. We can't just take that at face value. So really when it comes to the steps, next step is to meet with that hiring manager. So if I'm not on the phone with that particular person, when they tell me that they need a CRA, it's following up with them to say, hey, listen, I understand you've had a role approved on your team. I've got a bunch of questions for you. Is this for monitoring? Is this going to be an in-house full service role? Is it sponsor dedicated and, functional service provider setup? What country is it going to be for? Is there a certain therapeutic area we need this person to have a background in? Is it a certain level? Is this a junior CRA? Do we need somebody with lots of experience in a particular area or supporting X amount of sites? Is there language needs? Is there travel required? Is the budget approved? I know I got this email saying you're ready to hire, but you need to make sure that there is budget approved. We've got our resourcing on board, and we said they need this person for these reasons. Is the role urgent because of a study startup timeline, a resignation, a commitment? The title might say CRA, but the business, will make that a lot more specific. And that's where we come in, is having those conversations, making sure I understand, a CRA for, let's say, an oncology study in Brazil with strong site management experience is very different from a CRA in Mexico who might be able to support, broader study portfolio and work across multiple sponsors. So it's my job to ask those questions to turn, let's say, a brief into what we're actually looking for.
And you've worked across several CROs over your career. Would you say that's kind of similar across most? Yes.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the expectations, the focus, the geography, the therapeutic area, potentially that might change, right? Depending on the organization. But that process of, we've got the job description that says CRA and having to really qualify that, to understand what good versus great looks like, let alone just, the brief itself is super important and something we have to do all the time, regardless of company I've worked for.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess, we get the job, it's approved, we get the details. What happens next?
Yeah. It's interesting. There's like a lot that actually happens or people that get involved before like a candidate interviews, let's say. So at first, like I said, I might have this conversation with the hiring manager. So what is it that you're looking for? Why is the need here? And what good versus great looks like in a candidate? And then it's talking to the hiring manager, potentially the HR business partner that I work with really closely, our compensation team, our finance team, potentially other operational leaders, because this might impact, right, our project, our program, how we're going to approach something. And so getting all these leaders and getting these folks involved to understand what is the compensation we can offer, what are the benefits, what will the interview process be, should we find a candidate before we actually have that candidate in hand. When do we need them to start? Maybe because of that timeline. How do we want to advertise? Who do we want to approach? Do we have internal candidates we want to start with? Have they been identified? So there's a lot of questions leading up to, I'm going to actually start reviewing resumes and reaching out to people. And, I think it probably feels very slow from the outside. You and I have both been on the outside in terms of supporting organizations, right, from a recruiting standpoint. And I think the adage is, internally, companies are very slow. Externally, we can move really fast. And, not all of it is just the recruitment process, which can be fairly quick, especially depending on the individual recruiter and their ability to do their job. But it's, getting all this alignment right around a company, and especially in a global environment, it can sometimes make it more challenging.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, communication at the moment is perhaps quite difficult between the hiring communities and the candidate communities, right? And there's quite a lot of gaps there from my findings at least. And there's quite a lot of myths and misconceptions. There's a lot of noise. Obviously, you open LinkedIn and majority of the time you see CV coaches promising you, 90% ATS scores and whatnot. So I get, even the other day I had a candidate who reached out to me and said, oh yeah, I've done my CV and it's a 95% ATS score, yet I haven't received an interview. I was still rejected. Do you know why? And it was quite baffling to me because I've never known an ATS score to actually matter internally or externally when I've represented a candidate. So I think, that's a really big myth at the moment, right? And I think we've got all these CV individuals who promise the ATS perfect score and whatnot, who really just pry on the vulnerability of some candidates who are quite active on the market and perhaps quite disillusioned with the overall process. So what would you say are the biggest misconceptions with when candidates look for jobs in clinical research in this climate?
Whew. There's a few. I haven't heard that example you just gave, and that's interesting. I mean, I guess the challenge with the ATS score or making sure your resume aligns with it is that the job description is actually reflective of what we're looking for in a candidate. And while you might say like, well, what do you mean you're advertising a job description that isn't reflective of what you're looking for? In a practical, let's say, explanation, you got in our company, thousands of people, right, working in particular roles. You have a hiring manager who's under pressure to deliver, and because maybe they're under-resourced, they need to go out and hire somebody. They dusted off a job description that's been approved at all these various levels. So by our legal team, by HR, by our compensation organization, by finance, to just create like, what is the role? What are the minimum requirements? What kind of compensation can we offer? And what's the budget the hiring manager has? And then we might be posting that because we don't have anything better at the time until, say, I have that conversation with the hiring manager to really define what the nuances are for the role. Even though that happens, those nuances can't all be added to a job description. So, I guess just to your example at face value from a misconception standpoint, you might have a perfect resume that you've leveraged either AI or your friends and family or just put some pen to paper to really have your resume match that job description. That doesn't mean that you're actually matching the need. You're just matching the words that have been written into that. So I would say, again, your ability to network and do some due diligence on the company and understand what the goals of the company are, what the challenges are. When you think about a role, so let's say a CRA in a company like Precision Medicine Group, all we do is focus on oncology and rare and orphan disease, meaning it might say we need a CRA with 5 years experience working across multiple geographies, Latin America, US, Europe, for example, in a full service environment. And you might be a CRA with those 20 years experience and tick those boxes. But if all of your background is in cardiology, unfortunately, like that therapeutic expertise, while it's not relevant, if we have a candidate who has that relevant therapeutic expertise, your ATS score is kind of irrelevant.
It doesn't really matter, right? And I think that's a really big point, and it's a great point that you're making there. And I think quite a lot of times candidates think they're being automatically rejected by by the ATS or by some robots, some AI. But I think I don't know anybody at least who has that sort of system. I think it's actually illegal in most cases, anyways. But I think another example that I can give you, I was speaking to a candidate the other day. Now, she is based in Central and Eastern Europe, in a country in Central and Eastern Europe, but she's applied for a specific CRO for a position in France, for a position in Germany, and for a position in the UK. The roles that she's applied for are in those locations. She is not based in any of those locations, nor is she able to relocate there. In some of the cases, she would need to speak the local language as well. But again, she was rejected. And the way she interpreted the job advert in itself, because it said remote, she completely disregarded the country because it's remote. So in her mind, I guess it made sense on one hand, right? It's remote, therefore, and it's a project management role. So you can do the project management role from anywhere because you're not going to site, you're not going to an office, you're not managing a local team. It's a project management role. So technically you could do it remotely, right? So she was quite upset because she got rejected from them all. She didn't understand because on paper, the job in itself, she knows how to do and she is qualified, but she isn't in the right locations. Do you come across that?
Actually, so currently, as I mentioned, we're really building our Latin American operations. And you can imagine there's a lot of, let's say, movement between Mexico and the United States. I've had several positions which they're based in Mexico, and I have people who are of Mexican descent, maybe are from Mexico and moved to the United States, for university, but they live in the United States applying for our roles because they're remote. And they're like, well, I'm a Mexican citizen. And it's like, okay, well, are you planning to relocate to Mexico? It's like, no. Well, we're not going to consider you because you have to be in country. And, why? Well, one of the main answers is, from a budget standpoint. The salary we're going to offer in Mexico is going to be very different in the United States. One candidate I had, which not necessarily as a joke, but I said to the person, I said, well, listen, this is what the salary would be in pesos. Mexican pesos. Would you accept that being based in New Jersey? And they're like, no. It's like, well, there you go.
This would be why.
So, it's, hey, you need to be in country because of like our goals as a business to have that footprint for certain reasons, as well as, pay in that currency, right? And that
cost
budget
to hire as well.
With it. So the cost of hire. So we're getting that quite a bit actually right now. And I'm still reaching out to some folks who have good backgrounds in the US. And I'm just asking the question, like, are you open to relocating to Mexico? And I had one individual who was. And so, but my feedback to that individual was, well, the resume you submitted and like what you put in your application, like you didn't actually explicitly say that. I happened to put forward the extra effort and just curiosity and reach out to you to talk to you a bit more. But that would have been my recommendation moving forward is if you want to be based in Mexico, either update an address that, would be the address, let's say if you were to move to Mexico, and then also make sure you articulate like open to relocation, you have the right to work, let's say in Mexico as a country. And then at least that puts you on my radar as I'm reviewing, applications to say, well, here's somebody who's not here, but they're open to it. And then I can, talk to them about it actually being something they really want to do. And then actually, if I can keep going for a second, one of the misconceptions you mentioned is like AI is just screening out all the resumes. So just to be clear, now I haven't worked at every company in the world, and I think there's some companies that are probably a little more sophisticated in leveraging AI than, life sciences companies as an industry, just because of the conservative nature of what we do, et cetera. But there is no AI, at least that I've seen today, that will just completely screen through candidates and provide me as the talent acquisition, leader with the resumes that are the right fit. Like there's certain technologies now that have stack ranked, candidates based on keywords, based on location. And again, you being specific in your resume with your experiences will help with that. But there's nothing that actually is just screening people out. It's still me manually going through every applicant.
Yeah.
So there is no AI that's just telling people no. The data point I would give, and this may not be the case for every company, but right now we're averaging 700 applicants per role.
Wow. Yeah.
And I say that not to discourage people, but going back to, you might think AI is screening out. Actually, just the volume of applicants, is against you, because I'm manually going through, let's say, 100 applicants. If I go through those first 100 people and I find 20 really qualified people with the right background, the right motivation, the right experience, I'm going to be hard pressed to go through the next 600 because I don't have that time on my hands and the ability
Absolutely.
to do it. And so, again, your ability to network, make sure you get your information in front of the right people, being able to articulate, why you're the right fit for the role, just based on your experiences and outlining those in the right way, that's going to help you, because AI is not going to get you the job or not get you the job today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say, if I can add to that from my own experience, I guess, I kind of explain to candidates this whole, AI screening and AI ranking, which is really just searching for the keywords on your CV, is not that different from a junior recruiter who doesn't know the industry, literally scanning the job description and your CV for keywords.
Correct.
10 years ago, recruiters, we were the biggest enemies because, we didn't know the industry. Some of us 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, we all started from somewhere. And obviously, a junior recruiter is much more likely to overlook somebody who has the experience but isn't well spelt out, right, in the CV or in the application. And I liken that a lot to the way AI works, right? It's scanning for different things. Like, for example, I don't know, I have somebody applying for worldwide clinical trials and I'm looking for a CNS CRA. I know that, CNS is one of the strongest area of expertise that a company like Worldwide Clinical Trial has. AI won't know that. So unless the candidate actually has CNS spelt in their CV and a list of all their indications, AI might actually rank them down, as with a junior recruiter, because they won't see CNS clearly spelt out in the CV. I know that because I've worked in the industry for 15 years and I know which companies do what therapy areas, but AI or a junior recruiter don't, right? So I think that's, to your point, make sure that your CV is specific and has enough information that somebody can go by, whether it's an AI, ranking it, or a junior recruiter who's not worked on a CRA position before.
And like I've given advice in the past on tips and tricks, if you will, how to like bypass maybe this AI or ATS. And, you can, in like at the end of your CV in very small font and all white font, just put a ton of keywords, right? Well, that might get you past, let's say, this ranking, but it won't get you past me actually reviewing the CV. And that's where the specificity is really important. For example, if it is a CNS, study, right, and it's phase 3, we want somebody who has that experience and understands, big clinical study and what that might look like and what some of the nuances are. And so you still would want to have a bullet point, let's say, outlining responsible for, CNS, therapeutic area, clinical studies in phase 2 and phase 3 across XYZ geographies. And, spelling that out and that specificity, that's really for the human, to read, to actually know that you're right fit for the role. It won't change the stack ranking piece potentially, but like that's what's going to be the opportunity for you to be a shortlisted candidate versus somebody who, was, let's say, cunning enough to list all of the keywords, to match the job brief itself.
It's quite interesting. And I think that also adds to the volume of applications that we see, right? I don't know about you, but at least over half of the applications that I get are completely AI fabricated a lot of the times, not just AI written or AI embellished, just complete fabrications in a lot of the cases. And then I think I spend more time really digging into that person and seeing, whether the profile matches their LinkedIn, whether it matches, the CV I had from them 2-3 years ago, or the discussion we had on LinkedIn a couple of years ago, or, whether they appear on Zoom info and so on. And then you spend more time actually, requalifying something that is completely fabricated than actually speaking to real people.
Well, and it's more obvious than, well, I hope you realize how obvious it is as an applicant. I mean, I think the ability to use AI, right, to ensure that your resume is crisp, concise, articulate, especially if English is your second language, right? It's a great tool for grammar and, just kind of putting words together in a structured way. If you're making things up on your resume, it's not going to work. And it didn't work before AI. If you say, I'm an expert in X, and then I ask you, tell me about X, and you're like, well, I don't really know it. I just put it on my resume. Like, you don't go very far in that situation, and you didn't go very far in that situation before AI. So, it's not going to work. And I think, somebody really changing their resume per role, where to your point, if you go to the LinkedIn profile, if you might look at, I mean, we're a long-standing company. It's very interesting to see there's candidates who, have applied 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They have a resume on file. You look at that resume and you compare it to the new one, and obviously they've had some experience in the past 2 years. But when the experience prior to that completely changes, that's a red flag. You applied 2 years ago and you had 10 years experience. And when I read your 10 years of experience, here's all the things that you're responsible for. Here's all the accomplishments you had. I just got a new resume from you that may or may not have been updated by AI. And when I review those 10 years of experience, like, it is literally a different document than the one that you uploaded 2 years ago. That's a miss as a candidate. And it's pretty obvious. And the reality is, all things being equal, and we're averaging 700 applicants, when there's a discrepancy like that, the easiest thing to do is just move on to another candidate versus picking up the phone and like asking why. And there might be a reasonable explanation, or maybe it's just a mistake. Maybe you let AI go too wild on its editing. You may not ever have the chance to explain that.
But I guess, if you are a CRA or somebody who works in the industry, your attention to detail should be pretty good. So I guess, if you kind of let AI run wild with your CV, that is a little bit of a red flag though, no?
Yeah, like, with AI, again, not bad. And my recommendation, I mentioned this the other day to somebody, it's helped me, let's say in my resume, like articulating something I forgot about. So, let's say you are taking a job description or a brief and you're asking AI to help you with your resume to match that. What I would really focus on is, has it given a bullet point of something that, you did and you were successful at and you made an impact with, that you hadn't listed, and it's a real thing. And it's a skill, an experience, responsibility that elevates you as an individual. Like, that's a really cool opportunity, to add something you missed, potentially in adding to your resume. Creating something out of thin air that you've never done, that's not going to help you. So, I think you just kind of thinking through, right? How do you use this tool, which ultimately AI is today, and leverage it in the right way so that it can add value to how you're trying to show up versus, trying to trick the system. It's going to be more valuable, in my opinion, than the latter.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, my advice to candidates is always kind of use AI as a coach, right? And interrogate it as much as it interrogates you. Like, I always, when I give the prompts to whatever tool I'm using, be it Claude or Chat or Gemini or whichever else, I always ask, ask me questions before you produce. But then obviously, I always kind of double check. I did a presentation the other day and, I was kind of brain dumping into it. And I was trying to make a point with the time to hire. And I've asked, in the presentation to include a graphic to make it look prettier. And then when I was reading through it and I was fact checking, I kind of saw that in the presentation. It very nicely went from, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks. And I thought this looks a little bit too perfect. And I didn't give it this data. Where did it get it from? And I asked it, and this was Claude in this instance, and the reply was actually, I made it up. It looked good. So that's the perfect example,
Yeah. And I think, again, just think about it. Again, it could look good and it could sound good. If you can't explain and defend it, it's not going to work.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if I'm doing my job, I'm super curious. And so I'm going to ask questions, whether it's super relevant to the role or not. And as soon as you have a bullet point that just is fabricated, can't explain your way out of that. So yeah, hopefully those are some helpful tips that we've just talked about, because I think I'm seeing this a lot right now internally. And unfortunately, this fraudulent candidate piece, not only is it a challenge for companies because you're let's say vetting through, applications that really aren't relevant to get to the candidates that have taken some time to apply because of their interest and their experience. But on the candidate side, this effort is actually muddying the waters and making it harder for you to get through to the right person. So
absolutely,
you can't change everybody's but yeah.
Yeah, and I do think candidates, this is probably quite useful to mention as well. I think a lot of candidates, particularly within certain areas, right, like clinical operations, CRA specifically, data management, some programming, there is such a high fraudulent rate, specifically in North America. And there are so many fraudulent applications and candidates. And there are, whole ringleaders and whole operations with it. And I don't think a lot of candidates realize just how much fraud we deal with on a daily basis. And I know I've had candidates in the past who questioned why I ask for references at this stage, why I check previous employers, why I'm doing 7 years of background checks, if they're a contractor. And unfortunately, this is why. It's not because I don't trust them specifically. It's because I trust nobody, after the experiences we collectively as an industry have had with fraudulent CRAs who falsify, data and who falsify visit reports, and, the extreme lasting damages that could have on a study is terrible to think of. So we have to take these precautions. But I don't think a lot of candidates realize just how much we deal with fraud.
Yeah, and sophisticated fraud. At least it's, I think, around IT, some of this AI roles. I mean, there's some really sharp fraudulent candidates, and it's a shame because, to your point, there's a patient at the end of what we do.
Exactly.
And that's what's really exciting, in my opinion, about our industry and what we get to do day in and day out. But this current trend is not only making it harder for the really good people to find the right roles, it's also making an impact to some of these patients that are hoping for a study to be successful and move forward as needed, and get to its end point, which hopefully is a positive one. So yeah, and I think from candidate standpoint, what can you do? I guess it's just making sure you've got a voice, right? You've got visibility, you've got updated CV, right, that matches your LinkedIn profile. You've networked and you've put yourself forward in a way where, like, I kind of know who you are as best I can, right? Like you can't network with everybody and every recruiter in the world at every company, but I think you can make yourself known, at least from a digital standpoint, where that question doesn't come up. Is this person real or not? And then just know that some of this is out there. Like, we, unfortunately, in the US have had to start where, for our CRA and our clinical trial manager roles, on the final interview with the leaders, what we're asking is actually that a candidate holds up their ID, and they can cover up their personal information, but that picture being recorded with them is something that we're doing just because we want to compare that to, let's say, who shows up on day one. And it's not, we don't trust you as a candidate, but there's candidates out there we can't trust, and we need you to do this. And we're not picking on you, but it's a great way to ensure that, we've got an ID, we've got a picture, we've got a recording. We can match that to the credentials being put forward for onboarding. We know somebody hasn't let's say, taking your place, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and that's actually what I do as an agency as well. So when I submit the candidate, I normally send like a 10 or 20-second snippet of my conversation on video with their ID as well, a lot of the time. And again, that way I ensure that the candidate I spoke with is the same candidate that your hiring manager speaks with. And you in turn, ensure that is the same person who turns up to site. As we all know, well, we've all had it happen, right? When somebody else entirely turned up to site, unfortunately. And because majority of these roles are fully remote, it takes a little while to
Yeah.
realize. I've had a lot of situations where the IP addresses were in entirely different countries in the end. And they were, laptops were shipped in different countries. The work was actually being outsourced to different locations. So there's a lot of sophisticated fraud out there, as you say. So we all have to be quite vigilant about it. But again, I think a lot of the candidate community don't realize just the lengths that we have to go through and why we have to go through these sorts of checks.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time just us having this conversation. I think it's pretty wild that you have this level of sophistication from a fraudulent candidate standpoint, but it's a good call out, and I hope people watching this realize it's there. You shouldn't necessarily be concerned about it. But again, if you can make sure that it's really clear that you are who you are in an easy way
absolutely.
for companies to identify, that's a good thing. So yeah.
And I think, similarly, I think candidates always need to be aware of, potential fraud with recruiter impersonation as well. There's a lot of cases going around at the moment where candidates, as soon as the open to work banner comes onto LinkedIn, they get a ton of reach out from fraudulent recruiters, right, and from individuals who impersonate either company recruiters or agency recruiters in some cases as well. So I saw it the other day. I think somebody from one of the large farmers, their recruitment team had been impersonated, but the email address was something like, I don't know, for the sake of argument, at gsk.com or something along those lines. So it's very, very similar. Quite difficult to, kind of notice at first glance for somebody who's not used to the email addresses. And then, it kind of came up with a link of here's how to check your ATS score and things along those lines. And obviously, once you click on those links, your data is compromised. So candidates should be quite vigilant and always ensure that they get emails from verifiable email addresses. The profiles have pictures. Everybody that I know in talent acquisition in the industry has a picture and a presence on LinkedIn. So if those don't exist, this is, it's not real.
Yeah, that's a shame. And, I would just say, at least from my standpoint, and I think for most of, let's say, our industry, a recruiter that's internal to a company, they're going to reach out via email typically to be the first pass. It's going to have their signature in their email, right? Should include a LinkedIn link to their profile. If they do want to schedule some time, it's going to be, please provide your availability. And then they would create an invite and send that. Like I would never send just a link to say, hey, let's just jump on this Google Meet right now.
Yeah.
So I think, if you're just getting, join this Teams meeting or, I'm going to send you WhatsApp, click on the link so that we can chat. Join this Google Meet. That's probably
I think anything with a link at first is a no-no, right? I mean, to be fair, I do actually have my bookable link on my signature, right, which allows people, to get into my calendar and book a meeting. So hopefully people don't think I'm spam after this.
But I think that's the case, right? It would be, we need to find some time because, I'm working in a role in a company today, and I wouldn't expect you to just be able to drop on a call at the drop of a hat. So, yeah, I think if you're getting messages like that from somebody who's a recruiter at a company, you could probably assume it's fraudulent.
Yeah. One question that I think, like most recruiters and like an agency recruiter, I get inundated with a lot of rec tech at the moment that promise to take me out of business or, clone me in efficiency. Is recruitment dead, Ali? Are we still, are we going to all be redundant? Are we still needed?
No, I think, in my opinion, like AI is going to continue to help us remove friction, in terms of hopefully reducing the amount of fraudulent candidates that we review because AI can detect let's say combat AI potentially, the judgment, the ability to understand somebody's motivation, adaptability, communication, ethics. Are they the right fit in terms of, hey, we've got a unique environment potentially compared to even our competitors, let alone like clinical research organizations versus pharma, versus academia. Those are very different as well. And our ability to understand those nuances, make sure we can frame that in the right way for candidates so that they understand what they might be getting into and have that conversation around, is this going to be the right fit for you to be set up for success? I don't think AI can replace that by any means. So in my opinion, I think AI is going to help recruiters work faster. I think it'll help us reduce some of that friction, but I do think that the human side will actually matter more, not less. So yeah, I don't think there's any tech, or I don't think there's a tech stack that's going to make me obsolete today. That could change in the future, but I think there's still a need to have a conversation with somebody because it's almost impossible. And this is where I think I add actually a lot of value in the process is you can see a job description, you can go to a company website. There's still no way today, I think, for you as a candidate to understand like the environment, the culture, the team dynamics, what a day in the life looks like without talking to a person. And, that's what I can articulate on behalf of our teams, to any applicant, make sure that they feel good about, hey, you can chat with me. I'm here as a resource for you. I want to make sure you got a good sense for what you might be getting into, what the expectations of the team are going to be, how your success will be measured, how you'll work, right, on a day-to-day basis and like what that looks like. Because some of that is really important to knowing, like, do I spend my time even going through this process when this sounds like an environment that I'll fail in because, there's little team interaction, there's tools that I'm not comfortable with, there's a expectation that really doesn't align to my strengths, as an individual. And that's okay. But I think we do a really good job of articulating that. That's our job, our responsibility, for part of the process. And I'd be hard pressed closing my eyes and thinking AI could tell you, hey, we've got a leader who is really an empower of their team and they're, passionate about being a net exporter of talent, meaning they've got an organization that, for one reason or another is really a way for folks to come in and gain experience, not necessarily because they're junior or entry level, but just by the nature of the job. But knowing that that job and that role is a training ground to be armed with the experiences and skills to do other things in the business. And so, I have a leader who loves that and whose goal is basically to make sure that people get that exposure so that they can then be developed into a point where they can do a secondment to another area and have that exposure to say, hey, this is something that actually I want to pursue as a future of my career. Or, hey, we've got a team that's really technical, that is built around, longevity and people being in that role and part of that team for a long time makes them successful in their job. And the leader's really focused on continued training and development, but, kind of keeping people in that group. And there's reasons for it. I can explain that. I don't think, a technology stack is going to be able to do that justice. And, that I think ultimately is a big deal when it comes to people coming into the door and being successful in their role or not.
Absolutely. And I would say, perhaps on both sides of the recruitment process as well, right? When you take the brief from the hiring manager and when it's a hiring manager that obviously, or an organization that you've worked with for a period of time and you understand the culture and you understand what the team dynamic is and, what's missing from that team dynamic, an AI can't figure that out. For example, I'm working for, on a particular brief at the moment, and I know that the team is quite senior. So I know that, for example, although the job description is a senior position, I know that I'm actually looking at the lower level of that senior position. I'm looking for somebody who can actually stretch into that senior role, and this would be a step up for them rather than somebody, who'd make a lateral step or a downward step because of circumstances. So I know what the team dynamic is, and I can kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together, right? But I don't think an AI is actually capable of doing that, nor is capable to explain to the candidates and articulate well enough what the team dynamic or the culture is and what the benefits of them stretching themselves into this position might be.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the difference in your eyes between, internal TA and external recruiters?
Ooh, it's probably just, I mean, for a good internal TA, let's say professional and a good, external, kind of TA or recruitment person. I don't think there's a
Let's say
ton of
professional.
difference. Yeah, professional. I don't think there's a ton of difference. It's probably, just the focus. Like let's say personally, you add a ton of value, Theo, because of your ability to see a lot of companies and what they're doing at any given time. While I like to network and keep my finger on the pulse as much as I can, like my responsibility day in, day out is to Precision Medicine Group. And so, that ability to really understand the market, where things are moving, where there's opportunities, where there's nuances and new developments, whether it's types of technologies, business strategies, ways of working. I think that's where, external resources, right, can provide you a lot of insights and a lot of perspective on what that looks like. And then, to some extent, internal versus external, like I've got a lot of responsibility to protect the house, in terms of budget process, right? Some of the legalities around, how we operate and the questions we ask, the information that we're gathering from candidates, internal to a company. I've got responsibility to, ensure that I'm not exposing us from a liability standpoint, potentially as much as, like an agency, let's say, or somebody external might have to worry about. And then, I guess for me, what I've enjoyed about being on this side of the fence where I've done both is I do feel a bit closer as a partner to the business and an advisor to the business. Where, when I was on the outside looking in certain instances, I got there because of longstanding relationships, but I was still always on the outside looking in. And so, maybe it's just that visibility of when we were speaking earlier about like, what are the steps when somebody says, I need a CRA? Like there's a whole bunch that goes into that internally because we need to make sure that there's a lot of alignment. There's a budget piece, there's a process piece, there's consistency in how we operate and how we look for talent. And, not that that shouldn't happen if you're external, but I think, the alignment there is really like, what's the client need? Do I understand it as much as I should to articulate it to potential candidates? And then, focused on getting that done in terms of filling the role with the right person who's going to be super successful. We want to do that as well, but then we've got all these kind of internal pieces that go along with it because we're ultimately going to onboard this person and be responsible for that individual's growth, both as a person and a professional. And so, I think it's just a different lens, potentially that we're looking at internal versus external.
Yeah, I think I think there's been throughout this year, the years. I guess I've been in the industry now for 15 years, and there's been so many conversations around internal recruiter versus external recruiter, and the relationship between the two sides, and are we friends or enemies? I've always viewed it as a partnership. I think I help me. Help you, help me help you. The more information you give me, the more I can do, the better I can do my job. And equally, I guess, the more information I provide you from the external market and the more up to date I keep you as my client in the external market, the more we can help each other, right? And the more we can be proactive about pipelining of talent and about, the future of talent and where we're headed, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it just comes down to what are you doing every day? I can't just because let's say I've worked on, the outside of a company in the past doesn't mean that I know everything. Like everything's shifting, things are moving very quickly day in and day out. And so, the information, the perspective, the experience you have is super valuable, to how I operate and how I can keep my finger on the pulse of what might be changing. And then also the feedback, again, while I've got a good network and I have colleagues at some of our competitors that I can reach out to and just ask questions, hey, what kind of roles are you struggling with? Are you guys doing anything exciting in the world of AI that's creating efficiency, that's actually adding value, that's helping you delete processes or compress processes, right? Or augment processes? That's a ton of fun. And I can do that to some extent, but it's really hard for me to get feedback, let's say, from somebody who's seeing what's going on in dozens of companies at any given time. And, that's on a that's on a cadence that, is going to continue to evolve. So, me being in my role today, I need to understand what that visibility is. And, you being in your role today, that visibility that you have is super interesting. And I think us being able to share that and those nuances of what both our roles are and the environments we work in is a big deal. And we should keep doing that, because not only does it add value to the candidates that we work with, it makes us better professionals in terms of supporting this environment that, you and I have been working for a long time, because we want to help patients at the end of the day. And,
Absolutely.
us being able to get talent in certain situations actually creates that opportunity. Hiring this person who's an expert in XYZ, but not just because they're an expert, but also because they're going to thrive in this environment, might make the difference in a drug being approved, right, and being commercialized and getting to a patient that needs it or not. And, you and I have seen that play out in reality several times over the years. And, I think that's really exciting. But I think, for anybody who wants to create a wall there, they're missing a trick. And while, I don't give you a ton of business, Theo, because just how we're set up and what we're doing today, that could always change. That doesn't limit the fact, that we can share best practices and insights, and we can support
Absolutely.
people, through who we are and what we do.
And I think that's actually, the beauty of the talent community overall, that there doesn't need to be a divide between the two sides of the fence, because we can all share best practices and, market intelligence and information, and support each other in identifying ultimately, the best talent for our businesses, and, support each other. I guess it's similar, this conversation is very similar to, the friction between the hiring community and the candidate community. There are jobs to be filled. There are managers who need people in their teams, and there are candidates who, very much would like a job at the moment. But with all the noise and all the, the huge volumes that we're dealing with, the two sides don't really speak enough. And I think, obviously I've mentioned earlier, I think that the communication divide is something that I see day in and day out. And I guess we will probably reach an implosion point, perhaps, with the utilization of AI and outreach.
Yeah.
And we'll probably go back to the human basics. Good thing I've called it the human protocol. So, yeah.
Well, and I think it's interesting. There's going to be a shift as well around. So there's a term, skill-based hiring, that's buzzy. And I don't think anybody's really got that figured out in terms of how do you just evaluate skills when it comes to different roles. But I do think that, especially in certain technical skill sets, there's going to be a point where some of the, let's say, typical historic experience somebody would look for, in a candidate for them to come in and be successful is going to change, because some of the nuances of, let's say, compliance or industry, I think AI can help with, or you can train for, where like the mindset of how you approach a problem, and your ability to solve that problem, is going to become more important in terms of, like, what's a good example? Like database programming, and visualizations. I think actually there's a lot of really neat talent, that might be more junior for whatever that means. Maybe it's because they're from a different industry, right? So they're junior to the kind of research industry. Maybe they're a bit more junior in their career. They don't have as many years of experience doing X. But if they bring that mindset to the table, they might be much more effective, than somebody, let's say, who's been doing the job for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And not because that person doing the job for 20 or 30 years isn't capable or competent. But now there is other ways to approach it because of the technology that exists, fresh perspectives. And I think that's going to be an interesting, dynamic that is already starting to happen. Hey, I know how to ask AI the right questions, to get the results that I need. And that speeds me up. And that actually adds value to the process that we have today. And now we can maybe consider somebody different for that role, where in the past it was a bit rigid around, you need XYZ experience to be successful. I think that'll start to change very quickly.
I completely agree. Yeah. It's a fun ride we're all in for, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think I listened to a webinar the other day, and it said we're like the last generation of what we do, because AI is going to replace all of us. I don't know if that's
I
the
don't
case,
know. I
but
think when I always describe our generation. I guess we were born analog and grew up digital, right, or matured digital. But we were still analog, at our very core. And we are definitely the last generation of that, right?
yeah.
We're dealing with I've got a digital native around the house at the moment, and it's sometimes there's already a little bit of a little bit of a divide in logic. So if you if candidates or hiring managers are listening to this, if there's I guess three key points that you'd want them to walk away from this conversation, what would that be for you?
Ooh. Well, one would be, stop using a generic resume or CV. And I contradict myself because I've always coached that you shouldn't create a brand new resume, for every role you apply to. But I think, again, being specific as possible, being organized and targeted in what you're looking for and how you're describing your experience against, let's say, what you're looking for is going to be really important, because that's what's going to set you apart from other candidates, let's say, vying for a similar role. Build relationships before you need them. There's so much talent in this world and super interesting people doing super interesting work. You should always be curious and willing to, shake somebody's hand and have a conversation. And you just never know when those relationships will help you, whether it's solving a problem, whether it's finding your next career opportunity, whether it's, solving a problem for somebody else. Having that network in place and building those relationships and building meaningful relationships is something that's been hugely valuable to me in my career, both personally and professionally. And I wouldn't be where I am today without those relationships. And then, it's kind of in the same vein of being a bit strategic around your career search. It's not just about applications. You can put in 1,000 applications and you can get 0 response. You can follow companies, connect with recruiters, engage with leaders, ask smart questions, stay visible in your field, and you can apply to 2 roles and get hired for 1. So it's not always a
Absolutely.
volume game. It's something that you need to think through. And then, if I was going to give anybody like what's going to be important, like what would I focus on as a candidate and invest in? AI literacy would absolutely be one of them. And it's not
Absolutely.
that you need to be able to vibe code and program agents all day. That's great. And I think pursuing that gives you an edge. But just being able to leverage AI to improve research, preparation for interviews, productivity. I mean, those are going to be requirements if you're not already for most companies. And then commercial awareness. A lot of times, and again, this depends maybe if you're transitioning from academia to industry or if you're transitioning from a different environment to another one. Understanding how that company, how that organization makes money and being commercially aware lets you leverage your skills and experience against what the goals and experience, the companies need or are looking for, because you understand how you can support them in their goals, not just your goals.
Some really sage advice there. So, network, tailor, keep up to date.
Exactly.
That's kind of the key messages there, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Always be curious. I think, you've kind of taken in the olden agency days, in the olden days, as my daughter would say, we were taught ABC, always be closing. I think I prefer your ABC, always be curious.
Thanks, Theo. Yeah. And that's, it works. It's you asking questions. And I hope that's another tip I guess I would give in an interview. If you're not prepared with any questions, you're also missing a big trick. I mean, and I don't care what level of role it is, I realize people are maybe looking for a job at this point, and that's completely understandable. You should still have questions ready, though, to know how you're going to be successful if you're offered that job. What's the culture that you're stepping into that you're going to want to think about? Is that going to be a match for you or not? And so when people, I have a conversation, I say, well, what questions do you have for me? And they're like, I don't have any questions. I don't completely hold that against them because you don't have to ask me questions. But I think that, you're missing an opportunity, right? Whether it's being set up for success or if you end up needing to make a decision between 2 or 3 or 4 multiple opportunities, having those questions answered probably will help you define what's the right one for you versus, well, I didn't ask anybody questions. So now it's a money thing. Is it remote or not? I just think you might get yourself into a situation that's probably not the right one for you because you didn't come as prepared as possible. And that's where AI can help. Hi, AI, this is the role I'm about to interview for. What would be, 5 questions in bullet point format that I should use in this interview to make sure that it's going to be a fit for me and I'll be set up for success. And let it give you those. And then at least bring those to the interview if you haven't created your own from scratch.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also there's probably quite a lot of candidates out there who do have quite a lot of interview fatigue at this point, who've been who've come second or third place in a lot of interview rounds. And I think it could also, I don't hold it against candidates, to be honest, anymore, especially if I'm speaking to candidates who've been displaced for a few months or a significant period of time, and I can tell that they've got the fatigue. And they are quite tired of the interviews, and they're kind of going through the motions because they're disillusioned with the whole process overall. But I think that's where our roles as recruiters kind of come in to coach them through that and to support them and to kind of hold their hand through that. Again, I guess, to our point earlier, something that AI can't do. AI can't help with somebody's, state of mind when going in an interview. A tip I always kind of give my candidates is imagine you're gainfully employed and you don't need this job, and going in with that mindset.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, keeping your attitude and your energy up is hard.
Yeah,
it's important though, because it might feel like the 10th conversation for you, but for that leader that's potentially going to hire you, it might be their first one. And
exactly.
And you just got to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you so much, Ali. I think it's been, we could probably continue this conversation for another couple of hours, to be honest. So maybe we should do episode 2 and 3, or maybe, quarterly updates from the TA table.
I like that idea, Theo. I like that idea.
Yeah. It's an idea in progress, TBC.
That's right. No, thank you for the opportunity. And, I love the work that you're doing and Human Protocol, and, look forward to continue to have these conversations. And I think the industry is better for it. And, hiring's connected to something bigger. Again, in our space, right? The people we hire move studies forward, specific to clinical research. They support sites, patients, sponsors, science, and that matters.
Absolutely.
And the best part of, I guess, my job and I think your job is we get to connect those worlds, help companies grow, help people build careers, help teams make hiring decisions better.
Absolutely.
And that keeps me energized, so yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you so much.